Most Americans couldn't find Ukraine on a map before February 2022.
Now it's on the front page every day. But here's the thing. The war didn't start in 2022.
It didn't start in 2014. The conflict playing out right now is the latest
Chapter of a story that goes back over 1,000 years. A story about a piece of land that every empire in history has wanted. A people who spent centuries being told they didn't exist. And a nation that had to fight for the right to call itself a nation. To understand what's happening today, you need to understand all of that.
So let's start at the beginning. Before Ukraine was a country, before it was
even a name, it was a geography. And that geography explains almost everything.
The territory of modern Ukraine sits at the intersection of two completely different worlds. To the north and west, forests, rivers, the beginning of European agricultural civilization. To the south and east, the Pontic steppe, one of the largest grasslands on Earth, stretching from the Carpathian Mountains all the way to Central Asia. Flat, open, extraordinarily fertile, and completely impossible to defend. That last feature is the key to understanding Ukrainian history.
There are no natural barriers, no mountain ranges to hide behind,
no wide rivers that stop armies, just open land in every direction, connecting Europe to Asia, north to south, east to west. This makes Ukraine one of the great crossroads of the ancient world, place where civilizations meet, trade, and fight. It also makes it one of the most fought-over pieces of real estate in history. Every empire that has ever existed in the region has wanted Ukraine's territory, Ukraine's agricultural wealth, Ukraine's strategic position, and almost none of them ever thought of it
as belonging to the people who actually lived there. The first inhabitants we know much about are the Scythians, a nomadic, Iranian-speaking
people who dominate the Pontic steppe from roughly 700 to 200 BCE.
They are extraordinary horsemen and warriors, described by Herodotus in vivid detail. Their golden jewelry, their burial customs, their ferocity in battle.
Scythian gold artifacts found in Ukrainian burial mounds are among the most spectacular objects from the ancient world, many of them now in museums in Kyiv, some controversially taken to Russia during the Soviet period and still disputed today. Along Ukraine's Black Sea coast, Greek city-states established colonies beginning in the 7th century BCE. Olbia, Chersonesus, Panticapaeum. These are sophisticated urban centers, trading grain from the
Ukrainian interior to feed the cities of mainland Greece. Athens depends on Ukrainian grain the way modern Europe depends on Ukrainian grain today.
This is not a new relationship. The Greeks interact with the Scythians, trade with
them, occasionally fight them. The cultural exchange produces remarkable hybrid art, Greek forms,
combined with Scythian animal motifs. The Black Sea coast of Ukraine is part of
the Greek world, connected by sea routes to the Aegean. After the Scythians come the Sarmatians, then the Goths, then the Huns.
The steppe is a highway, and every few centuries a new people comes down.
Each leaves traces, genetic, linguistic, cultural, in the population that remains.
The Slavic peoples arrive in the region around the 5th and 6th centuries CE, part of the great Slavic expansion that populates much of Eastern Europe in this period. They settle in the forest zones and river valleys, farming, trading, developing the distinctive culture that will eventually produce Ukrainians Russians, Belarusians, Poles, and other Slavic peoples. And then, in the 9th century, the river routes of Eastern Europe become economically
critical, and a new power emerges to control them.
What comes next is the founding moment of both Ukrainian and Russian history,
and the source of one of the most consequential historical disputes of our time. The city of Kyiv sits on the high right bank of the Dnieper River,
a perfect location for controlling river trade between the Baltic and the Black Sea. By the 9th century, it is already a significant settlement.
In 882, a Varangian Norse Viking leader named Oleg captures Kyiv and makes it his capital, uniting it with Novgorod to the north.
This is the founding moment of Kyivan Rus, the medieval state that both
Russia and Ukraine claim as their direct ancestor.
This claim is the source of enormous historical and political controversy, so it's worth being precise about what the evidence actually shows. Kyivan Rus is not a proto-Russian state that happened to be located in Ukraine. It is a Slavic state centered in Kyiv, in the territory of modern Ukraine,
with a political and cultural identity distinct from what later develops in northeastern Russia. The people of Kyivan Rus, the East Slavs, are the common ancestors
of modern Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians. None of these modern nations existed yet. Claiming Kyivan Rus as exclusively Russian or exclusively Ukrainian is anachronistic.
What is accurate? Kyiv is the political and cultural center of Kyivan Rus.
When the state reaches its peak under Yaroslav the Wise in the 11th century, Kyiv is one of the great cities of medieval Europe, larger than Paris or London at the time, with dozens of churches, a sophisticated legal code, and dynastic connections to royal families across the continent. 988 A.D., Prince Vladimir of Kiev converts to Orthodox Christianity. In Chersonesus, in Crimea, in the territory of modern Ukraine, this conversion shapes the spiritual and cultural identity of all the East Slavic peoples for the next 1,000 years.
The thing that Westerners most consistently misunderstand about Kyivan Rus: it is not a Russian Empire with a Ukrainian province. It is a Kyiv-centered civilization. Moscow doesn't exist yet. The Russian forest principalities to the northeast are peripheral, minor
players in the world of Kyivan Rus. When Kyivan Rus fractures after Yaroslav's death, in 1054, divided among his sons, then their sons, the various principalities, go their separate ways. And when the Mongols destroy Kyiv in 1240, they destroy it so completely that the city takes centuries to recover. The political and cultural center of the East Slavic world shifts northward to Vladimir, then to Moscow, the descendants of Kyivan Rus, who live in what is now Ukraine, continue developing under Lithuanian, then Polish rule. The descendants who live in what is now Russia develop under Mongol, and then Muscovite domination. These two trajectories, running in parallel for 3 to 4 centuries, produce meaningfully different cultures, different political traditions, different spoken languages. By the 15th century, Ukrainian and Russian are already distinct languages, not dialects,
of a single tongue, but separate languages that share a common ancestor. The way
Spanish and Portuguese share Latin. A Ukrainian speaker and a Russian speaker today cannot
fully understand each other without learning the other's language.
This is the first thing the West doesn't understand about Ukraine. Ukrainian identity is
not a recent invention, not an artificial construct, not a Soviet product. It has roots going back to the medieval period, different from Russian identity,
developing on a parallel but distinct track The most distinctive expression of that separate identity emerges in the 16th and 17th centuries in one of the most colorful
institutions in European history. The word Ukraine itself is instructive.
It comes from a Slavic root meaning borderland or frontier region, the edge
Of the civilized world, where the settled agricultural zone meets the open steppe.
This frontier character shapes Ukrainian identity more than any other single factor.
The steppe is dangerous. Tatar raids from the Crimean Khanate regularly sweep into
Ukrainian territory, carrying people off into slavery. Ottoman sources suggest that around 2 million people from the Ukrainian and Polish territories were enslaved over the period from 1500 to 1700. This is an almost completely unknown chapter of history in the West.
the people who choose to live on this dangerous frontier rather than retreating.
To the relative safety of Polish or Lithuanian-controlled territory further west, develop a
distinctive culture. They are called Cossacks, from a Turkic word meaning free person or adventurer. The Cossacks are a military frontier society.
They live in fortified camps, the most famous being the Zaporozhian Sich, located
on islands in the Dnieper River, beyond the rapids, in territory that belonged to no settled power. They elect their leaders, the hetman, by vote.
They organize themselves democratically, at least internally. They are free in a way that
serfs in Poland or Russia are not. They are also ferociously effective fighters, cavalry warriors who know the steppe as well as the Tatars, who can match nomadic warfare with nomadic warfare. The Cossacks become the military backbone of the Ukrainian
steppe frontier. They fight for Poland, for Russia, sometimes for the Ottomans, sometimes for
themselves. They are mercenaries and freedom fighters simultaneously, depending on who's offering what.
1648. Bohdan Khmelnytsky, the hetman of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, leads a massive
uprising against Polish rule. The Khmelnytsky uprising is one of the most traumatic events in Polish history and one of the foundational moments in Ukrainian national memory.
The uprising begins as a Cossack revolt against Polish noble domination. It becomes a social revolution. Ukrainian serfs rise against Polish landlords, and it carries a religious dimension. Orthodox Ukrainians against Catholic Polish rule.
The violence is catastrophic and goes in multiple directions. Polish noble estates are destroyed.
Jewish communities, numerous in Ukrainian towns, where they served as tax collectors and estate managers for Polish nobles, making them targets of popular fury, suffer enormous
losses. The estimates vary widely, but the death toll from the uprising and associated famine and disease is in the hundreds of thousands to over 1 million.
Khmelnytsky wins stunning military victories but cannot sustain an independent Ukrainian state against the combined pressure of Poland, the Ottoman Empire, and internal divisions. In 1654, he makes a fateful decision, the Treaty of Pereyaslav, in which the Cossack hetmanate enters into some form of alliance or agreement with the Russian Tsar.
What exactly Pereyaslav means has been debated ever since. Russian historians have interpreted it as Ukraine voluntarily joining Russia, the unification of brotherly peoples. Ukrainian historians interpret it as a military alliance between two separate states, not a merger. The ambiguity is built into the original document. What is not ambiguous? Over the following century, the autonomy guaranteed to the Cossack. Hetmanate is progressively reduced by the Russian imperial government.
By the time of Catherine the Great, the Sich is destroyed. 1775. The Hetmanate abolished, and Ukrainian territories are fully incorporated into the Russian Empire.
Ukrainian nobles are absorbed into the Russian nobility. The Cossack free society is ended.
This is the second thing the West doesn't understand about Ukraine. The Cossack traditions gives Ukraine a democratic, egalitarian political culture, quite different from Russian autocracy. The idea that leaders should be elected, that communities have rights against central power.
This is deeply embedded in Ukrainian political history.
It's not imported from the EU, it's indigenous. But before Ukraine can assert that tradition, it must first survive an attempt to erase it entirely.
The Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union made multiple systematic attempts to suppress
Ukrainian identity. Understanding this history is essential to understanding why Ukrainians fight with the
intensity they do today. First, the language suppression.
In 1863, the Russian imperial government issues the Ems Decree, prohibiting the publication of books in the Ukrainian language, the performance of plays in Ukrainian, and the teaching of Ukrainian in schools. A follow-up decree in 1876 extends the restrictions further. The official position: Ukrainian is not a real language, just a dialect of Russian,
and promoting it is a cover for dangerous nationalist politics.
This is not ancient history to Ukrainians. Their grandparents were told their language didn't exist. Their great-grandparents were forbidden to publish in it. Ukrainian cultural figures who insist on their separate identity, writers, poets, artists, are suppressed, exiled, or imprisoned. The great Ukrainian national poet Taras Shevchenko, whose works are central to Ukrainian identity the way Shakespeare is to English, is arrested in 1847 and sentenced to 10 years of military service in Central Asia, with a specific prohibition on writing or painting. Second, the Holodomor. This is the event that most Westerners have never heard of, and it is the most important single event for understanding modern Ukrainian national identity. 1932 to 1933. The Soviet government under Stalin is implementing forced collectivization, seizing private farms and consolidating them into collective farms. Ukraine, the most agriculturally productive region of the Soviet
Union, is a key target. Ukrainian peasants resist. The Soviet response? Grain quotas that exceed what is actually available. Brigades of activists search homes for hidden food. Borders are closed. Ukrainians cannot leave to find food elsewhere.
Internal passports are required to travel, and Ukrainians in the affected regions are denied them. The result is a famine of catastrophic proportions. In one of the most fertile agricultural regions on Earth, people are dying of starvation. Estimates of the death toll range from 3.5 to 7 million Ukrainians in approximately 18 months. Children die in their villages. Parents watch their children die. People eat grass, leather, tree bark, and in the most desperate cases, things that cannot be named. The Soviet government denied the famine was happening even as it was happening.
Western journalists who reported on it. Most famously, Walter Duranty of the New York Times, who won a Pulitzer Prize partly for his coverage
of the Soviet Union, largely dismissed or minimized reports of mass starvation.
Ukraine today calls this the Holodomor, death by hunger, and considers it
a genocide, a deliberate attempt to destroy the Ukrainian people, or at minimum, to crush Ukrainian resistance to Soviet rule. 33 countries officially recognize it as genocide. Russia does not, arguing it was a tragedy that affected many Soviet peoples, not a specifically anti-Ukrainian act. The historical debate about intent is real and complex. What is not debatable? Millions of Ukrainians lost their lives to a state-induced famine, while the state denied it was happening. This experience is encoded in Ukrainian collective
memory at a level that is difficult for outsiders to grasp.
This is the third thing the West doesn't understand about Ukraine. When Ukrainians talk
about the threat of Russian domination, they are not talking about an abstract geopolitical concept. They are talking about living memory. Grandparents who survived, great-grandparents who didn't. The fear is not theoretical. After the Holodomor comes World War II, and,
for Ukraine, it is more complicated and more painful than anything Western textbooks describe. When Germany invades the Soviet Union in June 1941, Ukraine is the primary battlefield. The German advance sweeps through Ukrainian territory in the first months, and some
Ukrainians initially welcome the Germans as liberators from Soviet rule.
This requires explanation, not justification. After the Holodomor, after decades of Soviet repression, after the destruction of Ukrainian cultural and religious institutions, after the purges of Ukrainian intellectual
and political leadership in the 1930s, some Ukrainians see the German invasion as
an opportunity to escape Soviet domination. A Ukrainian nationalist organization, the OUN, Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, attempts to declare an independent Ukrainian state on June 30th, 1941. The Germans immediately arrest its leadership. Ukraine is not going to be independent.
It is going to be a colonial resource to be exploited, and insignificant.
Parts, depopulated to make room for German settlers.
What follows is the worst experience in Ukraine's already extraordinarily traumatic history.
Ukraine loses an estimated 6 to 8 million people in World War II,
military and civilian, out of a pre-war population of around 41 million. No country in the world proportionally suffers more. Ukrainian cities are destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again as the front moves back and forth. Kyiv is occupied for over 2 years.
The Holocaust in Ukraine is particularly devastating. Ukraine had one of the largest Jewish populations in Europe, around 1.5 million Jews. The German occupation brings mass shootings. Babi Yar, a ravine on the outskirts of Kyiv, becomes the site
of one of the largest single mass killings of the Holocaust. 33,771 Jews are brought there and shot over 2 days in September 1941.
The total number of victims at Babi Yar over the occupation reaches around 100,000.
The collaboration question is real and cannot be avoided.
Some Ukrainians participated in German organized violence against Jewish communities, as police auxiliaries, as
local administrators. This happened. Ukrainian scholars have grappled with it, honestly. At the same time, thousands of Ukrainians risked their lives to hide Jewish neighbors, recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations.
The complexity of the Ukrainian wartime experience, some collaboration, massive victimization, genuine heroism, and everything in between, is not unique to Ukraine.
It is the complexity of every occupied country in World War II. France has it. Poland has it. The Netherlands has it.
But in Ukraine's case, Soviet-era historiography suppressed honest examination of it, and post-Soviet Russian propaganda has selectively weaponized it, using the collaboration of some to label Ukrainian
nationalism as inherently fascist. This is the fourth thing the West doesn't understand about.
Ukraine. The Nazi charge deployed against Ukrainian nationalism in Russian political discourse is not a neutral historical observation. It is a deliberate political weapon, selectively applying the worst actions of some wartime Ukrainians to delegitimize all expressions of Ukrainian national identity. After Germany's defeat, Soviet power returns to Ukraine, and the post-war decades bring a new wave of Russification. Russian is promoted as the language of public life.
Ukrainian cultural expression is constrained. The Communist Party of Ukraine is staffed increasingly by Moscow loyalists. But Ukraine also experiences post-war industrialization, heavy industry in the Donbass,
military manufacturing across the republic. The Soviet period creates a modern industrial economy in eastern Ukraine that becomes culturally and linguistically more Russian, not because of ancient historical roots, but because of deliberate Soviet policy choices in the post-war decades. This, the different Soviet-era trajectories of eastern and western Ukraine, is essential for understanding the politics of independent Ukraine. December 1st, 1991.
Ukrainian voters go to the polls on a referendum on independence. The result? 92% vote yes. Every region of Ukraine, including Crimea, including the Donbass, votes for independence. This fact is worth sitting with.
Even in the most Russian-speaking, most industrially Russian-connected regions of Ukraine, overwhelming majorities vote to leave the Soviet Union and become an independent state. Ukrainian independence is not a Western Ukrainian nationalist project imposed on an unwilling East.
It is the choice of the Ukrainian population as a whole.
On December 25th, 1991, the same day Gorbachev resigns, the Soviet flag comes down over the Kremlin. Ukraine is independent
and immediately faces an almost impossible task: building a functioning state from scratch.
Ukraine inherits the infrastructure of a Soviet republic, but not the institutions of
a sovereign nation. The bureaucracy, the military, the economic system, the legal framework,
all designed to be part of a larger Soviet whole, not to function independently. The economy, like Russia's, collapses in the early 1990s as Soviet structures dissolve. Ukraine also inherits something else: the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world.
Thousands of nuclear warheads left over from the Soviet military.
In 1994, Ukraine makes what many now consider the most consequential foreign policy decision
in its history. In the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine agrees to transfer its nuclear weapons
to Russia and dismantle the launchers in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. The signatories assure Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Ukraine gives up its nuclear weapons 20 years later, Russia annexes Crimea.
The security assurances prove worthless. The United States and UK, bound only by a
political commitment rather than a treaty obligation, respond with sanctions rather than military action.
Ukraine's lesson from the Budapest Memorandum: when you give up your ultimate deterrent, your
security guarantees are only as good as the political will of those who gave
them. The 1990s in Ukraine are, like Russia's 1990s, a period of chaotic transition, economic hardship, and the rise of oligarchs who acquire Soviet assets for almost nothing. The political system is functional but deeply corrupt, a competition between different oligarchic groups for control of state resources. What makes Ukraine different from Russia in this
period? Ukrainian politics, however corrupt, remains genuinely competitive. No single faction achieves the kind of dominant control that Putin establishes in Russia.
Elections are contested and sometimes produce surprises. The press is restricted, but not completely
controlled. This difference between competitive corruption and autocratic stability matters enormously for
what comes next. Because in 2004, Ukraine experiences something Russia has not: a genuine
popular uprising that overturns a fraudulent election. November 2004. The Ukrainian presidential election produces results showing Viktor Yanukovych, the pro-Russian candidate, supported by Putin, defeating Viktor Yushchenko. Exit polls and independent monitors tell a different
story. The results are falsified. Ukrainians pour into the streets, not hundreds or thousands, hundreds of thousands, day after day, in freezing temperatures. In Kyiv's Independent Square, the Maidan, they are wearing orange, the color
of Yushchenko's campaign. The Orange Revolution. The Ukrainian Supreme Court annuls the fraudulent results.
A new election is held. Yushchenko wins. This is the moment that crystallizes the core of what Ukraine is politically and what it is not.
Ukraine is not a country that accepts falsified elections quietly. It is not a country where the population accepts that those in power will simply do whatever they want. The Cossack tradition of democratic accountability, however buried under centuries of imperial rule, is alive. The Orange Revolution also triggers an important reaction in Moscow. Putin watches a pro-Russian leader overthrown by popular protest and draws a lesson. Popular
mobilization can remove governments. This is dangerous. It cannot be allowed to succeed.
The aftermath of the Orange Revolution is, unfortunately, disappointing. Yushchenko's government is plagued by internal squabbling, economic difficulties, and corruption. By 2010, voters elect Yanukovych, the same politician whose fraudulent victory they rejected.
In 2004, in a legitimate election, people are frustrated enough with the Orange coalition's failures to give the other side a chance.
Yanukovych governs corruptly but within Ukrainian political norms until late 2013, when he
makes a decision that will end his presidency and change European history.
The European Union has been negotiating an association agreement with Ukraine, a trade and political framework that would move Ukraine closer to European institutions. In November 2013, under significant pressure from Moscow, which is offering a competing economic package and applying trade pressure. Yanukovych abruptly suspends the EU negotiations. Ukrainians go to the Maidan again. What begins as a protest against the suspension of EU negotiations becomes something much larger. The initial protesters are largely young, urban, European-oriented Ukrainians, people who want visa-free travel to Europe, who see the association agreement as a step toward a more transparent, rule-of-law-based system. Their slogan is, "Ukraine is Europe." Then, on the night of November 30th, 2013,
The Berkut, riot police, violently disperse a relatively small group of protesters, including students. The images spread on social media. The next day, the crowds are 10 times larger and include people who weren't necessarily pro-EU but are furious about the police violence.
This is the turning point. The protest transforms from a pro-EU demonstration into something
broader. A rejection of the entire system of governance represented by Yanukovych. Corruption, brutality, impunity. The Maidan becomes a protest against all of it.
For 3 months, protesters maintain a camp in central Kyiv in winter temperatures well below freezing. The government attempts to clear them repeatedly. Clashes become increasingly violent. In February 2014, snipers fire on both protesters and police. The identity of those who gave the order remains disputed and is the subject of ongoing investigation. Over approximately 3 days in late February, around 100 protesters and a smaller
number of police lose their lives. Yanukovych flees to Russia.
The Ukrainian parliament, including many members of his own party, votes to remove him from office. Russia immediately frames this as a Western-backed coup, a legitimate president, overthrown by violent nationalists supported by the CIA and the EU.
Western governments frame it as a popular revolution against a corrupt authoritarian. The reality is more complex than either narrative.
The Maidan was a genuine popular uprising. Polls consistently showed majority support for
the protesters across Ukraine, including in the east. It was also supported by Western governments who preferred a pro-European outcome. Ukrainian nationalist groups with genuine far-right elements played a role in the street fighting, and Yanukovych did flee, rather than attempting to use the full force of the state to suppress the protests, which he might have succeeded in doing.
What is not in dispute? Within days of Yanukovych's flight, unmarked military forces,
later acknowledged to be Russian, seize control of Crimea.
A hastily organized referendum, with Russian troops present, without international monitoring, produces
a result of 97% in favor of joining Russia. Russia annexes Crimea.
This is the fifth thing the West doesn't understand about Ukraine. The annexation of Crimea was not a response to the Maidan. It was prepared in advance.
Russian military intervention begins within days, impossibly fast for an improvised response.
The Maidan is the pretext, not the cause. Simultaneously, in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region, armed groups begin seizing
government buildings in Donetsk and Luhansk. The weapons, training, and command structure of these groups points to Russian intelligence and military involvement. 2 people's republics are declared.
Ukraine's army, neglected and underfunded after 20 years of independence, struggles to respond. A combination of Ukrainian military forces, volunteer battalions, and eventually a reformed professional. Army pushes back the initial advances. A front line stabilizes. A ceasefire, the Minsk agreements, is signed, then repeatedly violated. From 2014 to 2022, a low-intensity war continues in the Donbass.
Around 14,000 people lose their lives. The world largely forgets about it.
Ukraine does not forget. And what Ukraine does between 2014 and 2022 is the key to understanding what happens next. This is the chapter that most Western coverage
misses entirely, and it explains what otherwise seems inexplicable. How a country that
was militarily weak in 2014 managed to stop what looked in February 2022 like
an unstoppable Russian advance. After 2014, Ukraine systematically rebuilds its military. Defense spending increases from around 1% of GDP to over 5%. The army is professionalized. Soviet-era officers who proved ineffective or corrupt are replaced.
Training programs, including substantial cooperation with NATO countries, transform the force.
Soldiers who fought in the Donbass from 2014 onward gain real combat experience. New weapons systems are acquired. Domestic defense production expands.
The Bayraktar drone, purchased from Turkey, gives Ukraine an asymmetric capability it
lacked. But more important than the hardware is the change in will.
The experience of 2014, watching Russia take Crimea, watching armed groups seize the
Donbass, transforms Ukrainian society's understanding of what is at stake.
The abstract idea of national identity becomes concrete when your territory is being occupied. Ukrainian national identity itself strengthens dramatically between 2014 and 2022.
The percentage of Ukrainians identifying primarily as Ukrainian rather than Soviet or regional rises sharply. The Ukrainian language, which many Eastern Ukrainians had primarily used Russian in
daily life, sees increased adoption as a statement of identity.
Even Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the East, many of whom supported neither Yanukovych nor the Maidan, increasingly identify as Ukrainian rather than Russian.
This is perhaps the greatest unintended consequence of Russian policy. The attempt to suppress Ukrainian identity, to demonstrate that Ukraine is not a real nation, actively creates the strong Ukrainian national identity it was designed to prevent. Volodymyr Zelensky, elected president in 2019 in a landslide, is himself a symbol of this transformation. He is a Russian-speaking Jewish comedian from Kryvyi Rih in central Ukraine. He has no military background. He is elected primarily on an anti-corruption platform, not a nationalist one. When the full-scale invasion begins in February 2022 and Western governments offer to evacuate him, his response, "I need ammunition, not a
ride," becomes one of the defining quotes of the 21st century. February 24th, 2022. Russia launches the full-scale invasion. The Russian military plan, by all available evidence, is based on a fundamental misreading of Ukraine. The initial advance involves columns moving toward Kyiv from Belarus, evidently expecting
that Ukrainian resistance will quickly collapse, that Zelensky's government will flee or be overthrown, and that a new, compliant Ukrainian government can be installed within days. This is based on an assumption that Ukraine is not really a country. that Ukrainian national identity is thin, that Ukrainian soldiers will not fight hard for
a state they don't genuinely identify with, that the Ukrainian government lacks popular legitimacy.
Every one of these assumptions proves wrong. Ukrainian forces stopped the advance on Kyiv. Russian columns, stretched along narrow roads through difficult terrain, run into fierce resistance from
a population that knows the land and has spent 8 years preparing. Russian logistics, fuel, food, ammunition prove inadequate for a fast-moving campaign. Within weeks, Russia withdraws from the Kyiv region entirely.
The images that emerge from the liberated areas around Kyiv, from Bucha, Irpin, Hostomel, document what appears to be systematic violence against civilians. Hundreds of bodies found in the streets, in basements, in yards. The International Criminal Court opens an investigation. Russia denies responsibility and claims the images
are fabricated. The war settles into a grinding attritional conflict along a front line,
stretching hundreds of kilometers. Ukraine, supported by an unprecedented package of Western military and
financial aid, holds the line and in some areas advances.
Russia, drawing on its larger population and defense industrial capacity, absorbs losses and continues. This is the sixth thing the West doesn't understand about Ukraine, and the most
important. The war is not primarily about NATO expansion, or Western provocation, or Russians'
security concerns. At its core, it is about whether Ukraine exists as a separate nation with the right to determine its own future. Putin's 2021 essay arguing that Russians and Ukrainians are one people is not diplomatic.
Background noise. It is the actual belief underlying the military operation.
And Ukraine's response, the resistance of its population, the performance of its military, the extraordinary social cohesion under pressure, is the most definitive possible answer to that argument. A people that fights this hard for its independence is, by any
reasonable definition, a people. What happens next is genuinely uncertain. Wars of this scale and complexity do not follow predictable scripts. What is certain? Whatever the outcome on the battlefield, Ukraine's national identity